She liked us. Yeah.
Good morning and welcome to Unitarian Universalist Church in Idaho Falls. Do we need this higher? Yeah. My name is Annette Lovell. I will be your worship associate today. We are bringing the service with Reverend Kevin Carson and our media tech, Vic Allen. The service today is going to be talking about our sacred human need to connect with the wilderness, which for me is very true, but also a bit problematic. I work Monday through Fridays, so when can I get into nature? It's the weekends. So for the past 2 weekends alone, I've been spending it walking in the mountains and walking through the trees with the yellow and gold leaves and hoping for encounters with a wild animal of some kind. You know, it feeds my soul. The fresh air and the glory of this earth. It's sometimes really hard for me to put my butt in that chair on Sunday mornings. But every time I walk through this door, the sanctuary, and I hear the messages from this pulpit, I am fed and uplifted in another way. And today we hope to leave you here with a feeling of community, inclusion, acceptance, and hopefully you learn something from the words that Reverend Kevin has chosen to share with you today. So we acknowledge that it's difficult to get to church on Sunday mornings, and we thank you all for coming together on this beautiful autumn day, and welcome to our service. We do like to start our time together with a few announcements. First of all, our services are hybrid services with online as well as streaming as we meet in person here. So if you're joining online, please sign into the chat box so we can see who's joining us. We're glad you've tuned in. And if you want to share a joy or concern, if you're online, please put it on your chat box so we can grab it. If you're here in the sanctuary, there are papers at the back of the sanctuary that you can fill out your joys and concerns for later this afternoon or later in the service. Reverend Kevin is still trying to get to know people on a personal level. So if you have time during your week, he would love to sit down, share a cup and a conversation, a little chat. During his office hours is great. Please email him at his minister@idahofallsuu.org email, or give him a call, set up a time. He'd love to be able to have those individual conversations. Our pledge drive is wrapping up. If you have not returned your pledge cards, please fill them out and get them in ASAP. You can put them in the collection plate later in the service, or drop them in the thermometer right there on the south side. That has been updated this morning. We're getting there, but we still need more pledges. Today is our monthly potluck, our annual potluck. If you didn't bring anything, still please come downstairs, join. There's usually plenty, but that is right after the service. I said downstairs. And our men's group is meeting next Friday night, the 13th at 5:30 at Pam and Bert Lilburn's. So that's Friday night. And lastly, tomorrow is Indigenous Peoples Day, and the Boise UU Fellowship is having an event. There is a Zoom link that they have set up that was emailed to all of us in our weekly update. But if you did not get that, please contact the office to get that link. It's going to include storytelling and histories of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. It's going to be held tomorrow at 7 o'clock Mountain Time. And Kevin also has one announcement he'd like to share.
Yeah, I wanted to let everybody know that next Sunday will be a very different worship service than you're used to. We are pleased that we're going to be having Reverend Dennis McCarty, who's coming to share his one-man musical called Servetus, the Radical Reformed Musical. And so it will be a little longer. It's going to be about an hour and a half in total, with an intermission in between. And so we'll light our chalice and turn it over to Dennis, and it's going to just be all kinds of interesting music. That it's all original stuff that he's come up with. And he's doing it today in Salt Lake City, where he has relatives, and he'll be driving up next weekend and sharing it with us. So I really look forward to it. Regular time, 10:30, but like I said, it should be about 90 minutes or so, and he'll be open to questions and answers afterwards if we want to. So I'm looking forward to that. So.
Some of us longtime UUs are always throwing things out there. We need to mix it up a little bit. So here's your chance to mix it up. So let us now prepare for worship with a few moments to settle in. Let's pay attention to our breathing. Let us be relaxed in our bodies and our mind. Let us be at peace in our bodies and with our minds. And I will ring the peace bowl 3 times. We'll begin with our prelude. So if you are willing and able, I invite you to recite with me our congregation's covenant. Love is the spirit of this community, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And our chalice lighting this morning comes from the book Earth Prayers. It is an excerpt from a Pawnee song. It says, remember the circle in the sky, the stars and the brown eagle, the supernatural winds breathing night and day from our four directions. Remember the greatest life of the sun breathing on the earth. It lies upon the earth to bring out life upon the earth, life covering the earth. Remember the sacredness of things, running streams and dwellings, the young within the nest, a hearth of sacred fire, the holy flame of fire.
A growing number of cities and states in America will celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day this weekend. So I think it is a good time for us to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral land of the Shoshone and Bannock tribes, who along with other regional tribes and their ancestors dwelled and hunted in this area for thousands of years before European colonists arrived. I don't often include a land acknowledgement in our worship services, not because I don't think we need to be reminded, but because I think it is more powerful and meaningful when it is not just a routine thing we do. As we are all aware, the European colonization of America was devastating for Indigenous people, and it is good that we pause now and then to reflect on this and think about how we might do better going forward. Our call to worship this morning comes from Chief Dan George of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation from the book Earth Prayers. The beauty of the trees, the softness of the air, the fragrance of the grass speaks to me. The summit of the mountain, the thunder of the sky, the rhythm of the sea speaks to me. The faintness of the stars, the freshness of the morning, the dewdrop on the flower speaks to me. The strength of fire, the taste of salmon, the trail of the sun, and the life that never goes away, they speak to me, and my heart soars. I invite you now to rise in body or spirit and join in singing our opening hymn, number 12, O life that maketh all things new.
Where
feeling well today. So she asked me to share the story for Time for All Ages today. It is the tale of Rabbit and Coyote. These are tricksters known in a lot of our South American cultures, even in South America, or southern United States. So, one full moon night, Rabbit found a fill of chilies. He was so pleased to see them all glossy and green that he jumped right in and ate the biggest one. When the sun rose, the farmer came to check on the chilies, and they were scattered everywhere, and the biggest, glossiest, greenest ones were gone. Well, among the plants, he saw some rabbit tracks. So what did he do? He made himself a beeswax doll, and he set that doll in the middle of the field to catch the chili thief. When night fell, Rabbit returned. He saw the farmer made of wax and crept up to say hello and to ask for some chiles. But the wax farmer had nothing to say to Rabbit, nothing at all, and Rabbit was angry. Well, he punched the farmer hard. His right paw stuck in the wax, and still the farmer said nothing. So he punched him again with his left paw, and the farmer said nothing. Well, Rabbit was fuming mad, but the wax farmer was silent as the stars. So he hauled him up with both feet and he walloped him. Hey, 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 hey! And Rabbit was trapped for sure. Well, when the real farmer came to check his trap, he was delighted to see Rabbit there. Que delicio! How delicious, he said, rubbing his hands together. He popped Rabbit right into a sack and took him home. When he got there, he hung up the sack, built a fine fire, and set a pot of water to boil. Then he went looking for herbs. Well, from where he was hanging in the sack, Rabbit saw Coyote coming. "What are you doing there?" said Coyote. "Well, this man wants me to marry his daughter," Rabbit said, "but I'm too young. Why don't you take my place? Look, the water's ready for hot chocolate. It's going to be a fine party." Well, when the farmer came back and took down the sack, he saw Coyote inside. "Oh, you'll pay for this," he said, and he popped Coyote into the hot water. Ay, 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 ay! Coyote flew right out of that hot water and took off after Rabbit. He followed his tracks till he found him high in a hickory tree. "I'm going to eat you now," Coyote said, for he was very furious. So what did Rabbit do? Well, he knew that Coyote couldn't tell the difference between the fruit of the hickory, hard as a rock, and the soft white zapote. "Well, why eat me?" asked Rabbit, "when right here I have sweet zapote fruit instead?" "Well, toss me one," growled Coyote. Rabbit did that. He tossed down the hickory with all his might. Plunk! He hit Coyote and knocked him out cold as a cabbage. When Coyote woke up, he tracked Rabbit till he saw that furry scoundrel resting against a large rock at the edge of a tree, or the edge of a hill, excuse me. "Please don't eat me," pleaded Rabbit, leaning against the rock. "Can't you see that if I don't hold back this rock, it will roll down and crush the world? Here, you hold it for a while I find some people to help us." Well, Coyote believed Rabbit and took his place. And Rabbit hopped off, free as a bee. Soon, Coyote realized his mistake, and he went after Rabbit, muttering all the while. When at last he found him, Coyote said, "Now I will eat you. But then, who will take care of all the little children in this little school? He was pointing to a wasp nest on a low branch. Someone needs to give it a knock if the pupils try to leave. Well, Coyote loved to give knocks, so he took the job. He lay near the branch and waited, and when a wasp flew out, he whacked that nest with his little stick, and all the wasps came after him. They chased him into a pond, with only his nose sticking out, so they just stuck it many times. It was pitch black when Coyote found Rabbit at the edge of a lake, and he was really going to eat him. But Rabbit said, "Why eat me, Coyote, when I have been waiting for you so we can share the cheese that is right there?" Rabbit pointed to the moon's reflection in the lake. "Of course," explained Rabbit, "we must first drink all the juice of the cheese in order to eat the cheese itself." So Coyote began drinking the water to reach the cheese itself. After a time, he said, "I simply can't drink anymore." "Just a few more sips," said Rabbit, "and you'll reach the cheese for sure." So Coyote drank more and more and more. He drank so much that water poured out of his ears. But when he turned to discuss with his Rabbit, Rabbit had run away. Coyote ran after him as best he could, but he was swollen as a sponge. Now Rabbit knew of a ladder that reached into the sky. He began to climb up, and he hopped all the way to the moon. Then he hid the ladder. Far below, he saw Coyote looking for him up in the sky. But try as he might, Coyote never found the ladder. That is why, to this very day, Coyote sits gazing, looking at the moon. And now and then he howls at it, for he is still very furious with Rabbit. And we do not have any children to sing out. So, we don't. So we'll just go into our joys and concerns. Oh, let's see. We have a concern. Larry Frank had knee surgery. Victoria wrote, "I hope he recovers easily." There are 2 petitions. Oh, second thought. There are 2 petitions. One is promoting open primaries. The other is to support the Idaho Falls Library petition on promoting an open polling on books with parental input. I assume you brought these with you? Or you just want people to look? Oh, to do the other one? Okay. So, 2 things. Karen Schaefer concern? Same thing. So she has a citizens initiative for open primaries. Please see her after the service. And a joy also from Karen. Bob and I will be celebrating 52 years of marriage tomorrow. That's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. We have a joy and a concern from Cindy and Rob. So happy birthday to their oldest son, Dave. That's a joy. And Bob and his sister will be driving from Boonville, New York to Silverdale, Washington, stopping here in Idaho Falls. I guess that would be a joy and a little concerning, but also a joy, for sure. And Vic has a joy. tree hunter T.J. Watt found a western red cedar in British Columbia. The tree is 151 feet tall, 17 feet in diameter, and estimated to be over 1,000 years old. It is the second largest red cedar in the world as far as we know. That would have to be absolutely incredible to see. Yeah. I want to light one concern candle for my daughter, who is struggling so much with work and too much stress and too much stress and too much stress and too much stress. So I want to keep her in my thoughts. And Kevin also has a special concern.
I want to light a candle of concern this morning for what's going on in Israel and Palestine right now. It's a horrible situation. Already hundreds have died and thousands are wounded. And I really pray that it does not escalate into something larger in the Middle East, as we've seen in other times. So this is for what's in Israel and Palestine.
Vic, are there anything in the chat box? We will light one more candle for those joys and concerns we chose not to share today.
Our reading this morning is an excerpt from the book Wilderness and the American Mind by Roderick Nash. On April 23, 1851, Henry David Thoreau, slight and stooped, ascended the lecture platform at the Concord Lyceum. "I wish," he began, "to speak a word for nature, for absolute freedom and wildness." Thoreau promised his statement would be extreme in an effort to answer the numerous champions of civilization. "Let me live where I will," he declared. "On this side is the city, on that the wilderness. And ever I am leaving the city more and more and withdrawing into the wilderness." Near the end of the address, he concentrated his message in 8 words: "In wildness is the preservation of the world." Americans had not heard the like before. Previous discussions of wilderness had been mostly in terms of romantic or nationalistic cliches. Thoreau tossed these aside in an effort to approach the significance of the wild more closely. In doing so, he came to grips with issues which others had only faintly discerned. At the same time, he cut the channels in which a large portion of thought about wilderness subsequently flowed. The complex of attitudes toward man, nature, and God, known as transcendentalism, was one of the major factors conditioning Thoreau's ideas regarding wilderness. In the tradition of idealists such as Plato and Kant, the American transcendentalist postulated the existence of a reality higher than the physical. The core of transcendentalism was the belief that a correspondence or parallelism existed between the higher realm of spiritual truth and the lower one of material objects. For this reason, natural objects assumed importance because, if rightly seen, they reflected universal spiritual truths. It was this belief that led Ralph Waldo Emerson to declare in his manifesto of 1836 that nature is the symbol of the spirit, the world is emblematic. Nature mirrored the currents of higher law emanating from God. Transcendentalists had a definite conception of man's place in a universe divided between object and essence. His physical existence rooted him in the material portion, like all natural objects, but his soul gave him the potential to transcend this condition. Using intuition and imagination as distinct from rational understanding, man might penetrate into spiritual truths. In the same manner, he could discover his own correspondence with a divine being and appreciate his capacity for moral improvement. Yet, even those who sought higher truths intuitively found them frustratingly brief flashes. Nonetheless, Thoreau pointed out, man cannot afford to be a naturalist to look at nature directly. He must look through her and beyond her. An offering to support the mission of this church will now be given and gratefully received. Sometime around 30 years ago, in the early 1990s, I first encountered Roderick Nash's book, Wilderness and the American Mind, which is now considered a classic and one of the most influential books published in the 20th century. For its influence on the environmental movement, it ranks among other notable books such as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire. Dave Foreman, who was one of the co-founders of the environmental advocacy group Earth First, even called it the Book of Genesis for conservationists. And I think it is an appropriate comparison. Wilderness and the American Mind was originally published in 1967, and it has been republished several times since, with the most recent 5th edition published in 2014. While most of the material in the book has remained unchanged, each new edition included an updated preface and epilogue which added contemporary insights on trends in our perception of wilderness and ongoing activism aimed at wilderness preservation. The book began life as Nash's PhD dissertation in history at the University of Wisconsin, focused on the history of Americans' attitude toward the idea of wilderness. As an academic treatment of the evolving concept of wilderness and the imaginations of America's naturalists, philosophers, artists, poets, and conservationists over the centuries, the book is extremely thorough and well written. But what really appeals to me about the book is Nash's understanding of the spiritual connections and feelings that wilderness has evoked, and how that has found fresh expressions that continue to develop to this day. The passage I read this morning about American transcendentalists is a good example. Deep down, human beings have a strong spiritual connection to nature, and especially wild nature. And I believe we can't help but have an emotional response to wilderness that goes beyond a mere intellectual appreciation. But what exactly do we mean when we say the word wilderness? And how has that changed in the American mind over time? Our English word wilderness comes from the contraction of two Old English words, wild, which was used to convey the idea of something unruly, disordered, or confused, and dior, meaning animal. By prefixing dior with wildior became the word used to describe a region of forest, crags, and cliffs that was the home of savage or fantastic beasts. One of the earliest uses of the word wildior was in the 8th century epic, Beowulf. But in modern usage, wilderness is a tricky word. As Nash writes in the prologue of his book, the word wilderness has a deceptive concreteness at first glance. The word is a noun that acts like an adjective. There is no specific material object that is wilderness. The term designates a quality, as the Ness suggests, that produces a certain mood or feeling in a given individual, and as a consequence may be assigned by that person to a specific place. Because of this subjectivity, a universally acceptable definition of wilderness is elusive. One man's wilderness may be another's roadside picnic ground. Wilderness, in short, is so heavily freighted with meaning of a personal, symbolic, and changing kind as to resist easy definition. In other words, what constitutes wilderness is truly in the eye of the beholder. If I hike a trail into the Yellowstone backcountry, for example, it certainly feels like wilderness to me, even a short distance from the trailhead. And I am acutely aware that a grizzly or other wild animal could wander out to meet me at any point. But for a mountain man exploring the area 200 years ago, a developed hiking trail would seem like a superhighway. And for any of the Native Americans living in the area in those days, my wilderness would simply be the neighborhood. The concept of wilderness may be a bit fuzzy and hard to define, but we seem to know it when we experience it. For some people like me, the most sublime or intimidating experience of wilderness in its rawest, most untamed form, such as being deep in the mountains during a storm or paddling a Class 3 stretch of whitewater, can be an exhilarating and even spiritual experience. But for others, even the most welcoming patch of wilderness evokes feelings of fear and trepidation, and such negative feelings have a long history. One possible definition of wilderness is found in the language of the 1964 Wilderness Act, championed by Idaho Senator Frank Church, which established the National Wilderness Preservation System and authorized Congress to designate wilderness areas. It says, "A wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain." But while this legal definition used to justify wilderness designation for natural areas for the purpose of preservation is, a good, start, even that definition is problematic. The presence of roads or structures, even trails, reveal the undeniable presence of human beings. So almost no designated wilderness areas are untrammeled in the strict sense. So again, we must rely on perception and feelings to decide. Writing from an admittedly Western colonial perspective, Nash begins Wilderness in the American Mind with a look at the Christian perspective that colored perceptions about nature and wilderness at the time of European colonization. It strikes me as unfortunate that Christianity and its parent religion, Judaism, developed primarily in the ancient Near East, since this is an arid region where even the most verdant areas only receive about 4 inches of annual rainfall. The wilderness, and more specifically the desert in this case, is mentioned in scriptures many times, and it is never in a good light. As Nash describes, wilderness was seen as an inhospitable place where demons must surely dwell, or a place for the purgation of sin. In harsh environments like the Judean desert, so familiar to the biblical authors, human beings have a very tough time living or even surviving. And as a result, the negative image of wilderness in the Bible is contrasted with the paradise of the Garden of Eden, which was a place with an abundance of ripe fruits and vegetables for easy picking, the good life we are denied because of original sin. As Europeans adopted Christianity, this negative view of wilderness, combined with their own ancient folklore that stoked a fear of wild places in the imagination, especially the deep, dark woods where wolves and demonic entities dwelled. When they arrived on America's shores, Christian Europeans brought their ingrained prejudice against wilderness with them. But the so-called New World that awaited their arrival was not one big untrammeled wilderness to the indigenous peoples already living here, though large areas would certainly have qualified as such by anyone's definition. There is now strong evidence, some of it published in just the last week, that humans have been in the Americas for over 21,000 years, which is much longer than we used to believe. It is estimated that millions of indigenous people were living here at the time of first contact, with many of them living in substantial cities scattered across the continent. There was also extensive agriculture practiced by tribes throughout America, and in some places, the forests and rangelands had been managed with annual burning and other techniques. And we are beginning to appreciate that indigenous Americans also had a variety of spiritualities and religious practices centered on their connection to the earth and the plants and animals with whom we share the planet. Spiritual traditions we would do well to explore as we face our current environmental crises. But the sheer vastness of the land and the relatively low population density meant that to European eyes, the New World was an unimaginably large and untamed wilderness, peopled by savages who dwelled in the dreaded abode of imagined devils. And by the time the true colonization of America gained momentum in the 1600s, contact with Spanish explorers and coastal fishermen over the previous century had already decimated the populations of many tribes due to European diseases. The wildness of the land and its native inhabitants seemed even more pronounced. The howling wilderness of Puritan imaginations combined with the real dangers of wilderness travel and sometimes violent confrontations that arose from cultural clashes with the Native Americans. And it meant that wilderness continued to be regarded negatively by most Americans well into the 19th century. For the early European settlers, the Bible informed their sacred duty to transform the wilderness into cultivated farms and European-style townships and cities. Wild areas were not just seen as undesirable. To many, they were an affront to God. True appreciation for wilderness was slow to develop, but attitudes were beginning to shift as early as the 1700s, when the beauty of nature started to be seen as the most direct expression of God's handiwork, and a place where humankind might more easily experience the sacred. Still, however, even nature-loving transcendentalists in the 1800s, like Thoreau and Emerson, favored a balance between civilization and wilderness as the optimum condition for humankind, and felt more at home among the cultivated farms of New England. By Thoreau's own admission, he lived a sort of border life between the two. But in the first half of the 19th century, the landscape paintings of the art movement known as the Hudson River School, such as those of Thomas Cole, began to promote the beauty and wonder of the American wilderness as what made the new nation unique in the world. We may not have the centuries of history and art or the castles and cathedrals of Europe, but we had enormous tracts of land, of wild land, that was home to wild animals, rugged mountains, and an unparalleled geography they extolled with nationalistic pride. By the second half of the 19th century, the frontier continued to disappear as settlers poured into formerly wild lands and Native American tribes were subjugated and forced onto reservations. Some Americans began to feel that true wilderness was vanishing, and with it we were in danger of losing something important and even sacred. Philosophers, poets, and early activists began to argue for preserving some of the remaining wilderness before it was too late. Artists such as Frederick Church and Thomas Moran, the namesake of Mount Moran in the Teton Range, traveled west and began to paint the wonders of the western wilderness, Yellowstone, the Tetons, Yosemite, and the Grand Canyon. The images of Yellowstone, painted by Moran during the 1871 Hayden expedition, became instrumental in the creation of the national park. They allowed people back east to see exquisite depictions of the amazing beauty and natural wonders of Yellowstone and connect on an emotional level to begin to understand why it was so important to preserve this place for future generations. But despite successes in the late 1800s, such as the creation of Yellowstone National Park and the Adirondack Forest Preserve, now Adirondack Park, in upstate New York, preserving wilderness areas was often at odds with the spirit of progress at the turn of the 20th century. Nash describes the many political battles of the era, which witnessed some wins for wilderness and some heartbreaking losses, such as the fight over Hetch Hetchy Valley near Yosemite, a spectacular natural area championed by John Muir that became a reservoir. But even with the overly enthusiastic confidence in human and especially American progress during this period, it was also an era of conservation-minded politicians like Theodore Roosevelt and people I like to call wilderness sages, such as John Muir and Aldo Leopold. These were people who recognized the danger of losing our wild places and who were motivated on a spiritual level to fight to protect wilderness and the wildlife within, beyond just an appreciation for scenery or as a place for recreation. Writing in 1930, for example, Robert Marshall, who was a co-founder of the Wilderness Society and the namesake of Montana's Bob Marshall Wilderness, said, "There is just one hope of repulsing the tyrannical ambition of civilization to conquer every niche on the whole earth. That hope is the organization of spirited people who will fight for the freedom of the wilderness." Nash traces the overlapping lives of these important figures to whom we owe a tremendous debt in a trajectory that led to the modern environmental movement. They were not perfect people, and some of them were known to have expressed the overt racism of their era. But it is hard to imagine what America would be like today without their steadfast convictions about preserving wild places. The most recent shift in American attitudes about wilderness really began in the late 1960s, around the time Nash first published his book. Nash admits that his timing was very fortunate, and it is one of the reasons for the early success of wilderness in the American mind. Nash describes this period as moving toward a philosophy of wilderness. There are many sub-movements and philosophies that we could be lumped under this label, but in the broadest terms, we can describe this period of transition, which continues to our present time, as a decentering of the importance of human beings and a recognition of the intrinsic value of all creatures in our wondrous web of life on Earth. We are clearly a long way from most people on the planet embracing such a worldview. But a lot of people have, and the trend is positive. In such thinking, wild places and wild creatures are not seen as a commodity for our exploitation, but have rights and value for their own sake. Even rivers and landscapes can have legal and moral protections that with what has become known as rights of nature. It is a worldview that appeals to those of us who cherish our embeddedness in nature as a sacred relationship. But for some more traditional religious folks, this can be very unsettling. What does it mean for humans to acknowledge that we are only one of millions of species that have evolved over the last 4 billion years of Earth's history, and relative newcomers to boot? It forces some serious moral and theological reflection about our place in the cosmos that can be very uncomfortable. And even compared to Muir, Emerson, and others who thought of the wilderness as a church or sacred place to experience God, it is a shift in thinking that incarnates the holy in nature instead of being a place for supernatural inspiration. As Nash writes, wilderness could be sacred, but in its own right, and not as a sign or symbol of some overarching divinity. I'm guessing this is a sentiment that is shared by many contemporary Unitarian Universalists. And I also believe that many others would align with the transcendentalist view of wilderness as a place to experience divinity. As I said earlier, I believe that deep down human beings have a strong spiritual connection to nature, and especially wild nature. We are learning that wild places have practical value for our mental and physical health. And even when we are not experiencing wilderness directly, there is comfort in simply knowing that such places exist. In my daily prayer of thanksgiving, I always express gratitude for the wild animals and plants who share our earth and live for their own sake. Wilderness is sacred, and we need places like this, like our national parks, now more than ever, to inspire us and rejuvenate us to face the challenges ahead. As John Muir said, we need places to play in and pray in. I highly recommend Wilderness in the American Mind for anyone who wants to get a better perspective about the history of the American conservation movement or deepen their understanding of the possibilities of nature spirituality. The wilderness is waiting. And quoting Muir once again, between every two pines is a doorway to a new world. I invite you now to rise in body or spirit once again and join in singing our closing hymn, number 27, I Am That Great and Fiery Force. Our closing words are an Ojibwe prayer from the book Earth Prayers. Grandfather, look at our brokenness. We know that in all creation, only the human family has strayed from the sacred way. We know that we are the ones who are divided, and we are the ones who must come back together to walk the sacred way. Grandfather, Sacred One, teach us love, compassion, and honor, that we may heal the earth and heal each other.
We will now extinguish our chalice with the following words. They are in your order of service. You are invited to recite with me. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. It is time for our postlude. Be safe and be well.